The Nassau Institute proudly presents its inaugural Economics of Liberty lecture series. The lectures were conducted May 2nd and 3rd, 2011 in Nassau, Bahamas by Dr. Richard Ebeling, Professor of Economics at Northwood University in Midland, Michigan, USA. The Nassau Institute is grateful for Dr. Ebeling's dedication and assistance and great teaching ability. A special thank you is extended to the Templeton Foundations for their generous support, without which this event would not have been possible. We also thank the College of the Bahamas and Professor Randy Forbes for hosting this student lecture series in the new Harry C. Moore Library auditorium. Please enjoy Professor Ebeling as he discusses the economics of liberty.
All righty. Well, welcome back. You could have snuck out after eating lunch, but you didn't. Okay, this is good. The third theme of today, if you saw the program, is called Why Socialism Failed, False Dreams and Tragic Reality. At the beginning of the 20th century, the socialist movement was gaining momentum and support. Many intellectuals, many academics, a growing number of people in the general society were becoming sympathetic to and open to the possibility of replacing the market or the capitalist economic system with a system of socialism, where, as it was understood in the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, socialism would mean the government nationalization of the means of production. That is, government would take over industries, factories, land, all forms of manufacturing and production, and would then centrally plan an economic society, an economic system, with a central planning board. It was argued that such a system would generate greater wealth, it would involve greater economic or social equality, that it would be a fairer society, and a freer and a more prosperous society. That was the dream that the socialists had. Before the First World War, there really were no socialist governments. Socialist parties were beginning to gain influence in parliaments. For example, before the First World War, there was a very active socialist movement in old imperial Germany. And in fact, the Social Democrats, the Socialist Democrats as they were called, had almost a majority of the seats in the old imperial German parliament. There had already been formed a Labour Party, which was basically socialist in its orientation. In Great Britain, that was gaining seats in Parliament. The same thing applied to France, for example, or Italy. But the fact was, the only major country in the West that did not see an actively successful socialist party and movement in itself was the United States. Why socialism as a formal political and ideological movement never gained much traction in the United States is a separate story. But the fact is that before the First World War, before 1914, socialism seemed to be a growing ideal that supposedly would bring a better world. Justice, equality, better standards of living for all. But it was out of the First World War that the first experiments with socialism began. In the First World War, it's a story in itself, you had Germany, the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Turkish Empire, and Bulgaria on one side, and you had the Great Britain and the Empire, France, Italy, Imperial Russia, and then towards the end of the war, the United States on the other side. And during the war, because of its economic problems, a revolution occurred in Russia. The first revolution occurred in February of 1917. This had nothing to do with the socialists or the communists. The Tsar, that is the absolute monarch of the Russian Empire, abdicated. He left office. And a slightly left-of-center democratic coalition of new Russian political parties took over. And they were in power from February of 1917 until November of 1917, when a strongly radical and revolutionary part of the Russian socialist movement, led by a man named Vladimir Lenin, organized a coup d'etat. They called it a revolution. It was a coup d'etat to seize power in what was then the Russian Empire capital, or now the Russian Republic capital, of St. Petersburg. And as a consequence of this, for the first time, this coup d'etat occurred on November 7th, 1917, with Lenin's communist, or as he called them, Bolshevik forces, seizing power. The first experiment in a full socialist economic system began. At first it was opposed. There was a civil war in Russia. It went on from 1918 until 1921. Approximately 10 million people died in that civil war. But at the end by 1921, the communists, who now call themselves, these revolutionary socialists now called themselves communists under Lenin, had fully come to power. They now controlled a good part of what had been the Russian Empire, which a couple of years later they renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That part of the Russian Empire, which now is under this government's control, became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union, with of course Russia being the largest component of this new Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union served as sort of an example, an ideal. It was a great experiment in a radically new way of organizing society. Not private enterprise, not market competition, not the market profit motive, but government abolishing these institutions and planning from the center with government ownership and control. This system then spread to Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War, basically with the Soviet army advanced in defeating Nazi Germany into Central Europe. And then shortly after that, communism then spread to China. There was a civil war in China from 1945 until 1949, the result of which the communists won that civil war. Mao Zedong came to power. And another revolution occurred against the French colonial powers in Indochina under a communist leader named Ho Chi Minh, which led to the independence and initially the division of Vietnam. And then, of course, the Vietnam War, which the United States participated in. There was also a Korean War earlier in the 1950s. But by the 1960s and 1970s and beginning in the early 1980s, there was a great sense and concern that that communism would continue to spread around the world, and the socialist economic system with it, and that Western democracies, Western free enterprise systems would succumb. In fact, a well-known French social critic named Jean-Francois Revel, he passed away a few years ago, wrote a book in 1982 that first came out in French, then in English a couple of years later, called How Democracies Perish. And he felt that, that the Western democracies had lost their sense of idealism, their belief in their values, and that what was going to happen is that because the West had grown decadent and weak, and the communists were ideologically motivated, the trend of history was on the side of communist revolutions. Now, he wasn't saying that the West was doomed, but that was basically the implication. But the fact is that just a few years after he wrote this book, in the early 1980s, the fact is that 9 years after he wrote this book, it was not the West that disintegrated or fell apart or succumbed to the forces on the other side during the Cold War, but in fact it was the Soviet Union that disappeared from the map of the world. As I was mentioning, I had been in the Soviet Union during that time. I had been in Moscow during that failed coup attempt in August of 1991. I had seen the hardliners attempting to crush the budding democratic movement in Russia. I had also seen Soviet forces use great violence in the Soviet Republic of Lithuania earlier that year in January of 1991. I had been on the streets with Lithuanian friends when the Soviet military attempted to crush the Lithuanian democratic movement, and in one night shot 13 people and killed 3 others under the tanks of treads. I was in the crowd with my friends while this was going on. I actually saw people fall dead around me, bullets whizzing by. In fact, my face probably would have been